So welcome everyone. This is the Fix-It Fair at Home. Thank you for joining us. My name is Wing. I'm one of the coordinators of the Fix-It Fairs, which are City of Portland, Oregon community resource events. And with that, I would like to welcome our guest today, Master Gardener Dennis. Take it away, Dennis.
Thank you. Thank you, Wing, and welcome everyone. I am going to, it's kind of cold and snowy here in the front yard, so I'm going to move into the backyard where the weather's a little nicer before I start my presentation and share my screen here so we can start talking about things you can do now to get your garden ready for spring. This is called Garden of Eatin, Vegetable Gardening Tips for Spring. If that's what you're expecting to see, you're in the right place. Just a few things to get started. My name is Dennis Brown. I'm an OSU Extension Service Master Gardener volunteer for the metro area. The OSU Extension Service Master Gardener program educates Oregonians about the art and science of growing and caring for plants. Master gardeners are volunteer educators, neighbors, and on-the-ground researchers. We serve our community with solid training in science-based sustainable gardening and a love of lifelong learning. If you have questions about the Master Gardener program itself or want to become a Master Gardener, I can provide that information during the question and answer period at the end of this talk. Just to let you know how things are going to go in this talk, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes total. And about halfway through, I'm going to take a brief period for questions. We have maybe like 5 minutes. We could ask questions in the middle after we talk about the first couple of topics. And then we'll have questions again at the end. So without further ado, let's get our gardens ready to grow. A little more housekeeping there. So I'm going to talk about 5 topics today: selecting the right location for your garden, testing and amending the soil for pH and for nutrients, developing a planting plan that will give you a succession of plants to grow and garden all year round, so you'll have year-round produce, and also a plan that will help minimize some disease and pest problems. I will demonstrate how to make seed tape, and I'll talk about growing transplants at home, which helps you extend the garden season and also is a great way to reduce the effort in cultivating and controlling weeds in your garden. So let's, without further ado, talk about site selection. This is a photograph of my community garden that I had at one point. I've moved to a different one subsequently, and it has all the things that one likes to look for in selecting a site for your garden. It has a level layout, it has good sun exposure, there's nothing else around it, the soil was well drained, no conflicts with trees or other landscaping. These are all things, of course, you might be constrained in your own homes and your garden a little bit by your landscaping and stuff, but look for those, as many of those good components as you can in your garden in order to site it in the best location. Also keep in mind, where are you going to get water from for your garden? How far, is it from the hose bib, and how are you going to water your garden? And just to show you the evolution of that garden that I had, this is that same garden, and it somewhat demonstrates the succession of planting that can happen in the late summer. You see mostly summer crops in place right now with tomatoes and beans and some corn in the background, but there's also in the foreground with the poles and some fencing that are peas that I'm growing for fall. This is late August, and those peas will be ready for harvest in late September or early October. So the first topic after you've selected a site for your soil, I'm going to talk a little bit about collecting and analyzing soil sample, because the soil sample will tell you what your crop needs to help it grow better. And you probably can just grow things in your garden right now. The pH is probably good enough, and the soil concentrations are probably good enough if it hasn't been heavily gardened in the past. But getting a soil sample will tell you if you can actually improve the conditions a little bit. And I'm going to tell you 2 ways of doing that. But first I'm going to start whether to do it at home or whether to do it with a laboratory. But the first step that you have to do in either case is to collect a representative soil sample. And I'm going to play some videos, and I have to make a little adjustment to the sound so you can hear the video. So just give me a moment to do that and hit share. Every time I play a video, I'm going to give you a list of the components that you need to conduct the thing that's being demonstrated in the video. So here you have a list of materials that you need: a hori knife, you'll see that in the video, a mixing bowl, a container, and a marking pen. So without further ado, let's go to my backyard garden and see how to collect a soil sample. I'm here to demonstrate how to take a representative soil sample from your vegetable garden. I've assembled the things I need to collect the sample, and that includes a large mixing bowl like you might have in your kitchen. It can be stainless steel or glass or Tupperware. You'll need something to get the sample out of the soil. I like to use a hori knife. You could also use a trowel. You'll need a container of some sort to put the sample in to send it to the laboratory, something with a lid that fits tightly. And it's also good to have a marking pen of some sort, like the Sharpie, to write an identifier on your sample, just in case you're taking a sample from more than one location in your yard. So here's the place where I'm going to take my sample, and I'm actually going to take a sample from 3 different locations in my yard to mix together to make a composite. That way the sample is representative of the soil in my garden and not just of one location where I take one sample. So here where I'm going to take this sample, if there's any mulch or other covering on top of the ground, I move that to the side with my hand, and then I dig a hole about 6 inches deep, 6 to 8 inches deep, which is the depth of the root zone for plants. So once I have the hole dug, I take the hori knife and I slip it down about 1 inch behind the wall of the hole. And then I tip the hori knife back so that I get a profile of the soil from the bottom of the hole to the top of the hole. And so that way I get both a vertical representative sample as well as a spatial representative sample by taking the sample from various locations. Then I take that sample and I put it in the mixing bowl. And you notice that there was soil in the mixing bowl before. That's because I'd already sampled in another location. So when you get your samples all together, you put it in the bowl and mix it really well. And then you can put it in your sample container, like so. So that's how you take a representative sample from your vegetable garden. Next, we're going to talk about analyzing the sample by sending it to a laboratory, or you could do the sample testing at home yourself. I'm here to... So just to reiterate the soil sample collection, you want to sample from multiple locations to make a composite, and you want to sample the top 6 to 8 inches because most of your roots in your vegetable garden are going to be relatively shallow. Then what do you analyze for? Well, there's macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. There's soil pH, there's organic matter, and the micronutrients that you can analyze for. Let's look first at the ways of getting those analyses. So you can send your sample after you've collected it to a laboratory. And when you do this, you will send a lab sample information sheet with the sample to the laboratory. And this is one that's sort of typical. There's a lot of information. You can include your name. But if you look at this first line, there's a sample ID. You tell them what analyses you want. And then there's a couple of very important things that you want to check or that the sample form should have. One thing is you want to tell the laboratory what you're going to be growing, because their recommendations, if you're asking for recommendations, which you definitely want to do, their recommendations will vary depending on what crop you're growing. So you don't really need to get any more specific than, say, home vegetable garden for, like, if you're growing tomatoes and carrots and corns and beans and cabbage and lettuce and those sorts of things. But if you were growing blueberries, you would want to say that as it's something different, because blueberries have different requirements for soil pH in particular than a home vegetable garden does. So it's important to include that kind of information on the form. Also, it asks, there's a box here kind of in the middle, there's a green band that says check if recommendations are required. And like I said, you definitely want to ask for recommendations. And if they give you a choice of pounds per acre or pounds per 1,000 square feet, as they do on this particular form, definitely check the pounds per 1,000 square feet, because your calculations for how much fertilizer to add will be, or pH adjuster to add, will be much easier. So with lab testing, it's highly accurate. You'll get numeric values. You'll see that in the results sheets that we'll show in the coming slides. It provides recommendations for amending the soil, so you get very specific recommendations of how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, how much lime to add to the soil to adjust the nutrients or to adjust the pH. And it'll take about 2 weeks to get the results back. You can also get home testing kits. I have used the home testing kit for pH, which is really a great little trick, and I have a demonstration that shows you how to use those in an upcoming video. The difference between lab testing and home testing is that the home testing is lower accuracy. You're not going to get a number for pH like 6.5 or 6.7 or whatever that number is. You're going to get a range of pHs based on a colored reaction that you see at the home test kit. You won't get any recommendations, but I have some back of the envelope or rule of thumb recommendations that you can apply based on the results that you get from this home test kit. And the other advantage of this is the results are immediate. So let's talk a little bit about soil pH. So in the Pacific Northwest, soils are mildly acidic. They're generally range from 5.5 to 5.8. If you may recall from chemistry class, that the neutral pH is 7. Anything above that is basic or alkaline. Anything below 7 is considered acidic. So blueberries like this more acidic soil, blueberries and lingonberries, they generally like it maybe a little more acidic, 4.5 to 5.5. But most vegetable crops, which is our focus today, prefer a pH somewhere between 6 to 7.5. And the real sweet spot is 6.5 to 7, and that's generally the recommendation that the laboratory will be giving you to the target for. So things like beets need that higher pH. So here are the results that I got back from the laboratory when I sent in my soil sample. And there's a lot of information on here, but just know that this top part with the colored bands is a graphical presentation of the results showing whether things are high, medium, or low, red, green, or blue. In the middle are some numeric results, including for pH. And then at the bottom half of the results are actually the recommendations for applying fertilizer or lime adjustments. It's told in this little green and white table, and then there's some additional text below, which is very important to read. So for our pH analysis, the soil pH that in my backyard, which had not been gardened before, to my knowledge or in any extensive way, was 5.8, which falls right in that range that one expects for the Pacific Northwest. And the lab is recommending for adjusting the soil to that 6.5 to 7 pH range that I add 140 pounds of 100 score lime per 1,000 square feet of garden. So I'm going to take you through the steps to take these results to figuring out exactly how much lime to apply to the garden. So I went to a nursery and hardware store, and I found this product on the shelf called Super Sweet. It's fairly common, you see a lot of different places. And one of the things I looked for was, you recall that the lab said 100 score lime. So I looked for the lime score. This is a standard that the state of Oregon uses. It's the Oregon lime score. If you look down on the label just above net weight 25 pounds, you will see that this product has a lime score of 90, which means it's only 90% as effective as the standard. Nothing wrong with that. It's just different lime products have different lime scores. They have different chemical compositions and things, so they'll have different scores. So the state of Oregon has made this a standard to make it easier for us to figure out how much to add. So I'm going to take this 90 score lime product and put it on my 200 square foot garden. And this is how you do the calculation. So the recommendation is 140. I need to add a little bit more, so I divide by 0.9. to get 156 pounds per 1,000 square feet, but my garden is only 200 square feet, so it's only 20% of that. So what I need to do when we multiply everything out is that I need to add 32 pounds per 200 square feet of garden to raise the pH from 5.8 to that sweet spot range of 6.5 to 7. Now I'm going to show you how to use the home pH test kit and give you some rules of thumb for applying lime if you use a home testing kit instead of getting a recommendation from a laboratory. So let's take a look at this video. I've got two home pH test kits laid out here. One is unopened, and then the other one I've opened up and laid the components out across the table. So the test kit consists of a card which gives you information about how to perform the test and also the optimum pH for various vegetable crops. Inside the kit, the main component is a mixing chamber with a lid, a capsule of pH reagent, and an eyedropper for adding water to your soil and pH reagent mixture. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to actually take the measurement. So I open up my container and I take a small pinch of soil. And if you look closely on the bottom of the container, you can see that there's a dotted line. And I'm going to fill that container up to that dotted line with soil from my sample. Tap, tap, tap. That looks about right. Now I'm going to set this down and open up the capsule that contains the pH reagent. And this is always a little bit tricky. Sometimes the top sticks. I've pre-loosened it to make it a little bit easier. And inside is the white powder, which is going to cause the reaction and give the color change to tell us the pH. So now I take my eyedropper, and if you look closely, there's a second line at the top of the chamber. This is the fill line for the water. So I'm going to add some water to that till I get up to the fill line. 2 or 3 eyedroppers does it. I think about 3 maybe. Partway there. Yeah, 3 eyedroppers. Then I take the lid, put it back on the mixing chamber, and shake. And usually I do this for about 15 or 30 seconds. Take a look at it, make sure everything is getting mixed up really well. And now we have to wait about 10 minutes for the soil and sediment that's in the mixing container to settle to the bottom so that we can see the color change. And because I've done this in advance, we don't have to wait 10 or 15 minutes. We can look at the results right now. And I did 2 soil samples from my backyard. I took one from beneath my blueberries, and those results are shown on the left in the photo. And I took one sample from my vegetable garden, and those results are shown on the right. And you can see the difference in color, but you can also see that it's somewhat difficult to distinguish and is a qualitative assessment rather than a quantitative assessment of pH. So the pH under the blueberries, where I have acidified the soil slightly, is actually down in the range of 5.5 to 6. It's sort of a yellowish color. The pH from my vegetable garden is definitely darker green and is up around the pH of 7. So just to compare finally the cost of the 2 methods, lab testing, if you do pH only, will cost about $12 plus shipping of your sample unless you can deliver it in person. If you add in macronutrients and organic matter, you'll spend about $15. If you add in micronutrients, the price goes up to about $35. And it varies from laboratory to laboratory, but these are generally the prices that you will find. I don't do micronutrients at all. I did them once in my garden and I haven't done them subsequently. They seem to be okay. I'm not experiencing any obvious problems with micronutrients, so I'm not doing those again. The home testing kits, the pH test kits for 10 tests costs about $7, and you can get them from hardware stores and from nurseries and online from various locations. You can also get a combo pH and macronutrient test kit, which I have not used, and that costs about $8. So there's the difference. You can do this at home or you can do it with a laboratory. If you do the pH test kit at home, a rule of thumb that you can use for adjusting the pH is if you want to raise the pH of your soil about a half a unit, say from 6 to 6.5, you can add 10 pounds of 100 score lime per 100 square feet. That's 10 pounds of 100 score lime per 100 square feet to raise the pH a half a unit. And you can do that over a couple years if you want to slowly raise the pH, say from, if you have something like I did, 5.8, get it up into the 6 to 6.5 range and then 6.5 to 7 range. That's one way you can do it at home. Do a little bit at a time, and just until you get the range that you want. Just to tell you, if you're going the other direction, there are sulfur compounds, elemental sulfur compounds for lowering the pH. And for those, you add 5 pounds of sulfur per 100 square feet of garden to get the effect of lowering the pH by half a unit. So that's how you can use the home test kits without sending a sample to the laboratory. So next I'd like to talk about nitrogen and the nitrogen results. So let's look at the nitrogen results. They're circled up there on the left-hand side. The nitrogen was indicated as being low, 7 parts per million, and the recommendation was to add 2.9 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet during the growing season. And this is where it's really important to read the fine print. But it also says if you're adding nitrate nitrogen, don't add more than 1.5 pounds per 1,000 square foot at a time to avoid salt damage. And there are two kinds of, generally two or three kinds of ways that nitrogen is delivered. There's nitrate nitrogen, ammonial nitrogen, ammoniacal nitrogen, and then there's various organic forms of nitrogen like urea, and the nitrogen is released from organic matter. So there's a number of different sources of nitrogen. They're specifically talking about nitrate. But in any case, it's a good idea to split your nitrogen application, because if you apply it all at the beginning of the growing season, and especially if it's in the nitrate form, some of that might get leached out as you irrigate and you know, the rain still a little bit. It's better to do it in 2 applications, one at the beginning of the growing season and one maybe 1 or 2 months after, depending on the crop. Once the crops really start to grow, to give them that little boost of nitrogen during the growing season. So even if you're below that 1.5, it's probably not a bad idea to split that nitrogen application to give them plants a little boost of nitrogen after they've gotten started growing, once their roots are established. So just like the lime, I looked for products that I could apply, and all I needed was nitrogen. I didn't need any phosphorus, I didn't need any potassium. So I bought this grass fertilizer. Yes, you can use grass and lawn fertilizer on your vegetable garden. It's just nitrogen. So all I needed was nitrogen. It's a relatively inexpensive product. It doesn't contain any pesticides, herbicides. It's just a compound, a fertilizer that contains mostly nitrogen. And I can tell that by looking on the front label. There are 3 numbers, 26, 0, and 3. That's the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And all fertilizers that have those compounds in them will have those numbers on them, and they'll always be in that order: NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. More details you can see in the label little inset there, that it's mostly ammoniacal nitrogen. Some cite nitrogen from other sources like urea. So to translate this, my recommendations from the laboratory were to apply 2.9 pounds. I'm going to round that to 3. That's pretty close. And so I'm going to apply half of it now, which is 1.5 pounds, and then another half later on. So per 1,000 square feet, my fertilizer is only 26% nitrogen, so I'm going to have to add more of this compound to get that, and I'm going to adjust the application for the size of my garden. So just like with the lime, you do the calculations, 1.5 pounds divided by the percentage of nitrogen in the product means I need to add 5.8 pounds per 1,000 square feet, or 1.2 pounds per 200 square feet. And I did that twice during the growing season, once before I planted and once a month or two into the growing season as a side dressing, sprinkling it between the rows of plants to give my plants a little nitrogen boost. So I want to take a look now at what happened after 2 years. So I did this, and then 2 years later I came back and did an analysis. So if you look at it, after 2 years of adding nitrogen, my nitrogen has actually gone from 7 to 3, 7 parts per million to 3. It's less. Well, that's weird. Why is that? Well, a lot of it is nitrogen gets tied up in the soil, especially in the winter and in the rainy, cold months, and that's when I took my samples. So nitrogen is always going to be relatively low in your soil, except during the growing season and right after an application. Likewise, my pH has gone up, which is exactly what I expect because I've been adding lime to the soil. I didn't add the full complement of lime that was recommended. I actually did it over several years, so it only went up part way. That's why it didn't go up all the way to the 6.5 to 7 range. But not just one other curious thing about the results is the recommendations. So the nitrogen concentration in my garden has gone from 7 parts per million to 3, so it's gone down. And if you remember from the previous recommendation, the lab said add 2.9 pounds of nitrogen, and now it's saying, oh, you only need 2.2. Well, that's weird because I have less nitrogen, but they're actually saying I need to add less to be optimal for my crop. So why is that? And the answer is in the organic matter. Organic matter is a great source of nutrients for your soil, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but particularly nitrogen. And the laboratory takes into account the percentage of organic matter in your garden when it calculates how much nitrogen to apply. So my organic matter, which is a little on the high side, ideally it should be around 10% or less. It's a little high, but that's okay. I just don't add as much organic matter, much compost this year. It is a source, organic matter is a source of nitrogen, and it's supplying some of the nitrogen over the growing season as it decomposes. So that's why, even though the nitrogen concentration is lower, the recommendation to add nitrogen is also lower. So Wing, if we want, this is a logical breaking point to take a few questions, maybe like for 3 or 4 minutes. Maybe if we have 2 or 3 questions we could go over, and then we need to leave time at the end, but if we want to do that.
Dennis, that sounds great. Two related to this section, I think I'll combine. How often should we test the soil, and how do you decide which locations to sample?
Okay, for micronutrients, I did it once, everything looked fine. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, every couple years is what I do. The pH, once you get it into the 6.5 to 7 range, I would say, every 3 years or so. It's not going to change a lot over time. Probably just kind of test it maybe every 2 or 3 years for macronutrients and pH to see if any adjustments. And micronutrients, I wouldn't worry too much about at all. What was the other component of that?
How do you decide which locations to
sample? How would you decide which one? Perfect, good question. If your garden is relatively small, 100 or 200 square feet, just 2 or 3 places within that garden. If you're planting things in a couple different places in your yard, like some people use edible landscaping and they'll have a little garden patch in their front yard and a little garden patch in their backyard. The soil in those 2 locations might be slightly different. So maybe take 2 samples from those, take 1 sample from one location and 1 from the other location. And so that, if you think there's a reason, if your garden is big enough that there's different soil types within that space, maybe take a couple different locations that way. But if you just have most people's gardens are probably 100 to 200 square feet, just randomly select, or non-randomly select 2 or 3 equally spaced locations, let's say 3 equally spaced locations through your garden to take that sample.
Thanks. And there's a question, where do you obtain the information sheet for the soil sample?
Oh, the information from the seed for this soil sample is from that laboratory's website. There's actually a list of publications, Wing, that I think you guys are going to post on your website somewhere that lists, it's a publication that OSU puts out about laboratories in the state of Oregon, and it lists all the laboratories that do soil analyses in the state of Oregon. And you can choose any of those laboratories. I would look around and make sure they do the tests you want them to do, and also that they do home gardens. Some of them are geared more to agricultural stuff, larger stuff. But there is a list of laboratories in that publication. Otherwise, if you find a laboratory, they will have that on their website somewhere.
And thanks for that reminder, Dennis. I'll make sure that link to that gets posted in the comments just after this.
Okay, cool.
Do we have a little bit more time, or should we wait?
Let's take one more. Yeah, let's take another.
Okay, is there a way to know if your organic matter is too high without testing? What are the signs?
It's hard to tell just by looking if your organic matter, I mean, your organic matter can get too high and you can see some toxic effects, but that's really rare because vegetables actually grow pretty well. The big issue with having too much organic matter, excuse me, is that some of the nutrients I talked about, it's a great source of nutrients, and some of the more soluble nutrients can leach out of the organic matter. And if you have a lot of organic matter, those the leachate from your organic matter can carry down to groundwater and in runoff and add to the nutrient load in water bodies. So that's one of the things you're trying to avoid by not adding too much organic matter is runoff or percolation to the groundwater that contaminates essentially water sources. Generally, it's hard to tell without doing a test. I don't know of any simple test that you can do. If I think of something, I'll post that. But I can't think of any sort of simple test beyond doing a laboratory test for organic matter per se. Okay.
Yeah, we'll have time at the end to, I'm taking note on more of the questions as we go along.
Okay, and if people aren't satisfied with my answer, they can contact their local Master Gardener program and see if there's somebody, you know, who has time to go through a book and maybe find out some additional information if they think that maybe they could get more information. There's some information at the end of this presentation about how to contact your local Master Gardener program. So let's go on with developing a planting plan. I know someone had a question before this presentation even started about succession planting. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also not just when you develop a planting plan about succession planting so you can have year-round harvest, but also how developing a planting plan can help with disease prevention. So this is my garden. Again, the photo is a garden space in August. And then, oops, that same garden space in November. And so I follow my summer crops up with late fall and winter crops. And these are lettuces that I grow. I plant them in August, late August, and then I harvest them between Thanksgiving and Christmas generally, although sometimes I've had harvest as late as January. And then growing behind those lettuces in the front row are some mustard greens and arugula that will be ready for harvest. Well, they're actually ready for harvest right now in February, sometimes as early as late January. I have harvested some in January already, but mostly they come in February and March. And here's an example of a planting plan. And another thing that Wing is going to post is a planting plan for Oregon. And I know some of you who are listening are not from the Willamette Valley. There are different regions in Oregon that have different planting dates for things. And there's a planting date spreadsheet that is available that will be posted online that shows you when to plant different plants in the state of Oregon. Here's a typical succession planting that I use. I start, for example, one year with snow peas and shelling peas in the early spring, follow those up with summer crops, basil, chard, and turnips. Turnips are relatively short growing, a couple months and they're mature, whereas chard just stays in the ground all summer long and on into the winter. And basil, again, is like a 3-month crop. Those things can be followed up with mustards. I also use leeks. I often plant leeks in early August. I start them as seeds. I start them from seeds in the beginning of July, let them grow in pots until they're small sets. and then plant the sets at the beginning of September so that I can harvest leeks the following year in March and April. The chard is usually done in March. It starts to bolt, and so I take that out, and then I have a month or two in between those crops, and I can start again. I can prepare my soil, add nutrients, do some work, weeding and things, plant my corn, pole beans, and then follow up again with lettuce and mustards. So that's one example of succession planning. I encourage you to consult the planting date calendar to help with that, help you plan that out. The other thing about a planting plan is to remember where you planted things. This will help with disease control. This is a sort of a stylized garden where I've divided it into sectors, and I don't plant the same thing in the same place year after year because there are certain disease-borne organisms, fungi and nematodes and bacterial viruses that build up in the soil over time and attack things like tomatoes and squash. So from year to year, I move them from place to place to avoid some of the pest problems that might occur if you plant them over and over in the same place. Excuse me. This also shows you some of the successions I had: lettuce in the spring going to squash, then going to fava beans on the lower right-hand side. Next to that is turnips, followed by bush beans and carrots, followed by overwinter leeks. Those are some successions that I use. In fact, just this last week, I harvested mustard greens. The week before that, I harvested the last beets that I just left in the garden. I often leave fall-growing beets in the garden just to overwinter them. You got to get them out about this time, otherwise they start to, like chard, they start to bolt if you let them go in too much longer. So the last couple things I'm going to talk about are seeds and transplants. So seeds are great for large seeded crops. They're good for root crops that don't transplant well. You can direct seed them, or you can make seed tape, which is like it's seeds embedded in a paper strip that you can plant in the ground. It speeds up the planting process. It's something you could do now on a snowy, cold day. You could make seed tape. I'm going to show you how to do that at home, or you can buy it. I'm also going to show you transplant setup. Transplants are great because they extend the growing season. I actually have started transplants. I'm probably just a small little picture in the corner of your screen, but I've got some transplants that I started. I planted seeds on the 1st of February, and right now they're this big in my little container. I've got Joy Choi Pak Choi and Beni Hashi Mizuna growing up, and those will be ready to transplant in March. So they're growing in the transplant setup that I've got going, which you'll see in the videos that I'm going to play for that. So the first thing, though, I'm going to talk about is making your own seed tape. And so here's all the things you'll need to make seed tape. And again, it's just seeds embedded in a paper product. You can buy it commercially. There's an example on the right-hand side, but you can make it yourself using toilet paper. And it's great for small seeded things, and it gets the exact spacing that you need while you're sitting inside at home where it's warm and there's nothing else to do in the winter anyway on a snowy day. And then when you go out to the garden, you just dig a little trench where you want to plant it, stretch out the seed tape, cover it up to the depth that's required, and you're done. No bending over and trying to count out individual seeds and getting too many and then having to thin them out. So it's a simplifier for speeding up actual work in the garden. So let's take a look in the next slide about how to make seed tape.
I have two examples of seed tape here that I want to show you. One is commercially available seed tape that you can get from many seed companies. And the other is a piece of seed tape that I made myself last year. And the total length of this, it's folded up now, is about 5 feet. And that's a good length for your garden to set out a row of seeds in your garden. So I have laid out in front of me all the things I need to make seed tape at home. And for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to do a shorter piece today and show you how that's done. So I've taken a roll of toilet paper and I've cut it vertically into strips. And that's what I have laid out here on the table, about a 1-inch wide strip that's about 1 foot long in this case. And I'm going to use radish seeds to make my seed tape. The first thing I do is I lightly spritz the toilet paper with water. Just dampen it a little bit. toilet paper is designed to dissolve, so you don't want to get it too wet or it'll completely dissolve. So I have my radish seeds, and on the back it says to space them about 2 inches apart. So I've poured some out into this bowl, and I'm going to use some tweezers to place them onto the dampened toilet paper at about the distance that they specify. And so I have a ruler laid out there so you can see that. So I'm going to drop a seed about every 2 inches or so. There we go. And I'm going to probably put about 5 or 6 down here. And when I get to the end, I'm going to stop a little bit before the end, because you may not have noticed it on my homemade seed tape, but on the end, I write the name of the seed. So if I have a whole bunch of different seeds, I'll know which seed tape is which. Then, to actually set the seeds in place, I take a little kitchen spatula and fold the toilet paper over on top of the seed, just like this. There we go. I kind of pat that down a little bit to make it all stick together. And then I do it from the other side and fold it over the top again, just like that. There we go. And it doesn't have to be pretty. It'll all dry together. And then the end, I kind of fold a little bit by hand, just like this, to kind of flatten it. Oops, got kind of messy. That's okay, it's fine. And then I give it one more pat to make sure it's all stuck together nicely. Pat, 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 a couple times. And then you could lift it off, carefully lift it off the counter to move it to another location to dry so that you can do another piece. And here's a little trick. If in fact you've accidentally wet the paper too much, you can use a hair dryer and just gently dry the tape a little bit before you move it. I'm going to pick this up. Mine is actually pretty good shape. There it is. That's seed tape. You just let that dry on the counter, and then next spring you can take it outside and plant it in your garden.
And when's the right time to plant those seeds? Well, it's generally based on soil temperature, and that seed spreadsheet tells you based on calendar that Wing is going to make available. The planting date spreadsheet is going to tell you generally on the calendar when those soil temperature requirements are met. If it's too cool, you'll get poor germination and seeds might rot and nutrients are less available. Generally, minimum temperatures for germination on things like lettuce, cabbage, or pea can be done at 40 degrees, beet, chard, and potato at 45, and beans, sweet corn, and tomato like it really warm at 65. And just calendar-wise, I generally plant, I find that those temperatures are met for lettuce, cabbage, and peas around mid-March, maybe a little earlier, but about 15th of March. Beet, chard, and potato, a little later than that, mid to late March, early April. And then of course, beans, sweet corn, those don't happen until May, those temperatures. But you can also buy one of these temperature probes to stick in the garden, stick in your soil to see what the temperature of your soil is if you want to know more accurately. And some seed packages actually tell you that temperature. Some seed producers tell you that, others don't. Finally, I want to talk about transplants, getting a head start on the season. So you saw my little package of transplants that I put together. They're great for extending the season. I started them now. I'll put the transplants in mid-March. I'll have those produced by the end of April, beginning of May. So I save a few weeks there. You get better weed control. You can cultivate the garden clear of weeds and then plant transplants that are already 2 or 3 inches tall. So you get a head start on the weeds. Of course, you also have a wide choice of cultivars when you start your own, because anything you can find in the seed catalog that you can grow as a transplant, you can grow yourself. So let's take a look at my transplant growing station. I have this set up in my garage. You could also set it up in your basement or in some like your heated basement or unheated basement where maybe it's a little warmer than my garage is. But this is my setup. I use a light and a heating pad and some other components to see how they all fit together in this next video.
This is the transplant area I've set up in my garage. I want to show you some of the components that we've used to create it. First, there are 2 shelves. These were purchased at a big box store. Suspended from the upper shelf is a 4-foot length of shop work light. It has LED lamps in it. You could also use fluorescent. It's suspended from the top shelf with a chain link. Another important component of the system is this heating pad. And the heating pad is a propagation mat that keeps the temperature in the root zone about 10 to 20 degrees above ambient, which is really important for me because I have this set up in my unheated garage. And in February, my garage is about 40 degrees, 45 degrees. And this keeps the temperature in the root zone at about 50 to 55 degrees. Now I want to show you some of the control systems for the light and for the heating pad. So the light is connected to this timer. It's kind of a Christmas tree timer or a timer you might use on a lamp. And right now it's set at 13 hours of light and 11 hours of darkness. Over here we have the controller for the heat pad. And it's actually set at 70 degrees, although right now it's reading 67.8. And it works like the thermostat on your furnace. And it keeps the temperature at about 70 degrees, but sometimes it's a little higher and sometimes it's a little lower. It senses that temperature with this probe that you put in the soil where you're growing your plants. Now I'm going to put some of the plants that I've been growing up on the shelf so you can see how it all kind of fits together. These are plants that I started, about maybe 10 or 15 days ago. It's some kale, it's some lettuces, it's some Chinese greens. And because they're relatively short plants, I have the light very close to them. I have the light fixture all the way down to the bottom of these chains from which the lamp is suspended. Now here, I pointed out earlier that I have some tomato plants actually growing. It's some seeds that I planted just a few days ago. And by the time they're ready to leave this area, they could be 5 to 6 inches tall. And so one of the nice things about having a chain is that you can raise the light as the tomato plants grow. So by the end of the time when the tomato plants are on this heating pad, the chain will be about half the length that it is now. So there'll be plenty of room for my plants to grow. One other component I'd like to show you is this insulated pad that I have underneath the heating pad. And it helps retain some of the heat. You could also use cardboard, or you could use a sheet of plywood. In addition to help retain heat, I've added some bubble wrap around the outside. And that helps, especially in the colder days, to keep some of the heat inside where the plants are actually growing. So with this system, you can get a couple weeks head start on spring with your plants. I often start plants around the 1st of February, my cold season things like bok choy and kale and some lettuces, and then I transplant them about the 15th of March. My tomatoes, I start about the 1st of April, and they'll be ready to go in the ground under this system about the 10th or 15th of May. So with that, that's how you can get a jump on spring by growing transplants in your own garage.
And to recap that, there's a shelving component, a lighting component, and a heat source. And the bare minimum would be if you have a nice spot inside your house, in your basement or some unused corner of your house, where you can set up just a fluorescent light or an LED lamp. It's a shop lamp that's 4 foot long. You don't need the heating pad, and that's probably about $12 or so, $12, $15 from one of these hardware stores. The heat source and the controller are the expensive component. That's going to cost about $60 to $80 depending on what you do. So the whole thing with the shelving and whatnot would cost about maybe $100 to $120 if you set it all up with all of those components. If you just have the lighting components, you can do it much more cheaply because the lighting component is important because it makes your plants sturdier. You can set them in a windowsill, but they often tend to get somewhat etiolated, elongated from not having enough sunlight. So you want to, if you do put them in a windowsill, put them in the brightest possible windowsill that you have. So the last thing I'm going to show you is a little demonstration about how to make transplant pots. So rather than using the little 6-pack cells that you buy and sometimes are hard to find, you can make your own transplant pots out of newspaper. And the nice thing about them is they're totally recyclable. You can actually just take the pots and plant, tear the paper a little bit when you get ready to plant the plant in the ground. Just tear up the paper a little bit on the sides, break it up, and just plant the whole thing in the ground, covering up the newspaper and completely. And the plant roots will just grow through that newspaper. So in the next video here, I'm going to show you how to do that, and that will be the last component of my talk, and then we'll have some time for some questions.
I'm going to use some materials that most of us have around the house to create little transplant pots rather than using the 6-packs, which you have to buy in a store. And the materials that I'm using are a soda can, a relatively small diameter, a sauce can, like a tomato sauce can might work as well, as that will be our mold. A plastic container, you can get salad in these, or this happened to be an Aussie Bite container from Costco that will hold the small transplant pots that we're going to make. Some newspaper, this happens to be the New York Times Book Review, but the Willamette Weekly or another local newspaper would work equally well. I have seeds and some labeling material, and I have some soil, some potting soil that I bought. So let's take a look at how we actually do this. So the first thing you do is you take one sheet of newspaper and you hold it by the binding, the edge, and you can tear it easily into thirds, which is about the right size for your pots. And you want to tear it starting at the fold because of the way newspaper is made. It'll tear in a nice straight section that way. So then you open up the piece of newspaper and put it on your mold. And I like to do it about, maybe a couple inches up. And then I turn the can and roll the newspaper over. Roll, 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 roll. Till it's all on. Then I grasp it and I fold in the bottom, starting where the seam is. And fold that in really tight. And I push it with my fist in the palm of my hand. And also to really make it flat, I put it on the table and give it a couple of turns. Then I remove the newspaper from the mold, like so, carefully and slowly. And there's your pot. So the next step, the pots are going to go into this container. Here's some that I've pre-filled with soil, just to show you how it looks. And now I'm going to fill this container with soil. And here's a little trick for filling your containers. So what I've done is I've just filled it completely full to the top, maybe a little bit over. And rather than pushing the soil down with my fingers, I tap it on the bottom. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, 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 tap a few times. And you can see what happens is the soil naturally settles to about 1/4 inch below the top of the container. Now I'm ready to plant. So I have my chard seed laid out here. I take one of my seeds, and it said that the planting depth was 1/2 inch, so I've laid that on top of the soil, and then I have a little toothpick probe that I push the seed down with to about the 1/2 inch depth that I want. Cover that with soil, but I'm not quite done yet. I want to label it, so in case I plant more than one thing in this container, more than one plant, I can write on the side. That's one nice thing about having newspaper, is you can write right on the side what is in each container. And I've used a Sharpie in this case, but you could also just use a pencil. And then you put it in your container with the rest of your pots that have already been planted. And then you can add water. And you're ready to grow transplants.
And now you have some new ideas for getting your garden ready to grow for spring, how to select the right location, testing and amending your soil for pH and nutrients, developing a planting plan, how to make seed tape to make the garden work go a little faster when you're ready to go out, and how to grow transplants to extend your garden season. So I've got a few references here. These will also, Wing is going to post the more complete list of references. They're all OSU or Washington State publications, Pacific Northwest publications on home gardening. Those are available and they're free online. These are some of them. If you have questions for Master Gardeners, we do not have time for all your questions today. You can contact Master Gardener program in your area. If you live in the Portland metro area, you can go to metromastergardeners.org. We're also at The Real Dirt on Twitter and at Metro Master Gardeners on Facebook.